Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, our 7th edition of CarbonTalks. Today, we will be talking about avoided emissions again. What are they and how to leverage them in impact investing? Maybe you know us, but for those who don't know Carbonmetrics yet, we guide private market investors and their portfolio companies in effective decarbonization. We combine a consulting offer and an intuitive platform to answer our clients' need. You can see some of the clients we've already worked with, and you can see also companies we've computed avoided emissions for. So far, we worked with more than 120 financial institutions and 800 companies across 150 industries. I'm Agathe Martineau. Maybe you've seen me in previous webinars. I'm the head of marketing and partnerships at Carbonmetrics. And today, I'm very glad to welcome guests to this webinar. First, Laura Bollier, CEO of Climate Dividends. They are co-organizing the webinar with us. Thomas Stéphan, who is Senior Climate Consultant at Carbonmetrics, and Jocelyne Osdoba, who is the Director of Sustainability at Blue Like an Orange Sustainable Capital, who will discuss later Blue Like an Orange Sustainable Capital impact pieces. Laura, maybe you want to present really briefly Climate Dividends before we jump in?
Yeah, sure. Well, hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Agathe and Carbonmetrics, to organize this webinar today. So I'm the CEO of Climate Dividends. We are a non-for-profit who's created early 2023 with a sort of a bold mission, was to make extra financial performance count as much as financial performance in order to enable the funding to be much more driven towards ecological transition. And our first focus is really to look at climate performance, and steer investment into climate solutions. And for that, we developed the Climate Dividends tool and mechanism, on which I'll be able to tell a little bit more later on. And so our users are as many as investors, but also the companies that can value their positive climate contribution to their investors, such as you guys.
Thank you, Laura. So for today, we have, an hour, but we might finish a bit earlier. This is what we'll cover. So first, Thomas will guide us through kind of an overview of what avoided emissions are, the best practices, and the kind of the traps to avoid when talking about avoided emissions. Then we will dig a bit deeper into what Laura just introduced, the climate dividends, what they are, and why they're interesting when talking about avoided emissions. Then we will have the testimony from Jocelyne, and finally, we will answer your questions. So you might have seen at the bottom right hand of your screen, there's a question tab. This is where you can ask all of your questions while we discuss everything. We'll try to answer those as we go, and the ones that we haven't covered, we will take time at the end to answer them. The replay of this webinar will be shared after the session. You will also have access to the presentation slides, and the Q&A will be also written and shared with you, so you can look at it later. We've done a French version of this. It's available on YouTube. It was in early July. So if you're a French company and you're looking to maybe have additional insights from another French company, Estiome, there was a testimony down there, so you can find on YouTube, and we'll share the link afterwards. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to Thomas to present to you the methodology of avoided emissions.
Thank you, Agathe, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. So indeed, as we mentioned, I would like to give you a broad introduction to avoided emissions, how we calculate them, and what are the key things to have in mind when tackling this issue. So first, I think a good idea would be to try to understand really what avoided emissions are and what they aren't, because the concept can be sometimes a little nebulous and hard to replace within the broad scope of carbon neutrality. So let's take a few examples together. Let's say first we have a steel manufacturer that is replacing the thermal vehicles in its fleet by electric vehicles. Are they avoiding emissions? In that case, they're actually not. So it's a reduction of the carbon footprint of their company, not avoided emissions. Second example, let's take a consulting firm who is financing reforestation projects in the Amazon. Are they, in that case, avoiding emissions? In that case, still no, is this time carbon absorption via sequestration. Third, let's imagine we have a car manufacturer that is producing and selling small electric vehicles. Are they, in that case, avoiding emissions? Finally, yes, it is, in that case, avoided emissions. But why? So, to understand, let's look at the three pillars of carbon neutrality. We have first, obviously, the reduction of global emissions. Within this, we can have first and most commonly the reduction of our own GHG emissions. This is why the NZI methodology that we present here to you calls Pillar A, so the induced emissions of a company. We act upon this by measuring and reducing our own emissions across all three scopes using methodologies that you may already be very familiar with, like the GHG protocol or other similar frameworks. But it is not the only way to reduce emissions. We can also be acting upon others' emissions. And this is where the pillar B, avoided emissions, that we will be interested in today, comes into play. So here in that case, we will be offering products and or services that avoid emissions, or alternatively, financing reduction projects that are avoiding emissions. And this is where we will try to measure and then obviously increase our avoided emissions. Once we have done this work on pillar A and pillar B to reduce global emissions as much as we can, we have a third pillar, pillar C, which is sequestration, because carbon neutrality is the equilibrium between global emissions on one hand and carbon sinks on the other hand. So after the reduction of emissions, we will try to compensate residual emissions by either absorbing CO2 directly or indirectly, or financing sequestration projects. So if we circle back to our examples in the first slide, our steel manufacturer who was replacing its fleet of vehicles is acting directly upon its scope 1 emissions in that case. So it fits within pillar A. Our consulting firm who is financing projects in the Amazon is financing CO2 sequestration. It is thus within pillar C. So both of them are not avoided emissions. On the other hand, our car manufacturer is indeed offering products that avoid emissions outside of their perimeters by proposing a less carbon intensive alternative to mobility. So they do fall into pillar B, and they do have avoided emissions. So now that we know a bit better how they fit into the broad scope of carbon neutrality, let's try to understand together a little bit better avoided emissions. So avoided emissions measure the contribution to the decarbonization of the economy outside or on the fringe of one's perimeter. Very importantly, they are estimated by comparing your own solution, your own product, your own service with a reference scenario. That reference scenario is the most likely situation that would occur or would have occurred in the absence of your solution. It is very important to understand that not all companies avoid emissions. So eligibility is a key criteria to think about when considering avoided emissions. These criteria can vary from framework to framework, but most importantly, the solution needs to have a proven and substantial impact on the emissions of its perimeter. A few of the most common examples that we could call climate solutions are, for example, less carbon intensive alternatives. So that can be, as we've seen just before, electric vehicles for mobility. It can be solar panels for energy production. It can be efficiency-based solutions such as LED lighting, thermodynamic heaters, and so on and so forth. Very importantly, the effect must be measurable, attributable, and additional. So what does it mean? So measurable is pretty self-explanatory. It means that the solution needs to have a quantitatively measured impact on emissions. Attributable means that the avoided emissions needs to be traced back directly to the impact of that solution. And finally, additional means that if we have a value chain for which we have avoided emissions at the end, these avoided emissions needs to be properly allocated to each of the constituents of that value chain so that they add up to the total avoided emissions. So if we go back to our example of electric vehicles, for example, we may have someone who manufactures the battery, someone who manufactures the engine, someone who does the assembly at the end. And the avoided emissions of this final electric vehicle need to be properly allocated within these three actors so that they all add up to no more than the avoided emissions of the final product. So concretely, how do we measure them then? So as we've mentioned, we need to define the reference scenario. This is a very critical step in calculating avoided emissions. It needs to be credible and it needs to be representative of the company's context, the market context, the regulatory context, and so on. Then we will calculate the emissions generated on one hand by the solution and on the other hand by the reference scenario. The comparison and the difference between the two will be our avoided emissions, if there are some. Finally, we need to communicate transparently on avoided emissions, so specifying the reference scenario we have chosen, the hypothesis we have taken, the calculations we have made, and so on. So let's stop a little bit more on the reference scenario because it is really a key component of the calculation of avoided emissions. Calculating the emissions of your own solution is usually more straightforward because you have more often than not calculated already your own carbon footprint, you have data on hand, and you have better understanding and easier access to data in that case. On the other hand, the reference scenario can seem sometimes a little vague, but it's important to understand that choosing it needs to be the result of a thoughtful and precise reflection because the reference scenario needs to be realistic, so it needs to be based on facts, figures, and describe the most realistic alternative that would have occurred if the product being evaluated didn't exist. And then it needs to obviously be comparable. So the scope of the reference scenario and the solution need to be the same. So this is true in the way we calculate it. So both need to follow a life cycle analysis logic, with emissions being computed from materials to the end of life of the solution and being based on the same scope, on the same perimeter, whether it is geographical, temporal, technological, regulatory, and so on. So for example, let's say you're selling solar panels in France, you cannot use the European average energy mix to calculate your avoided emissions. You will need to take a local French-based emission factor for electricity production. So most of the time when you're choosing your reference scenario, you will have a decision tree that looks a little bit like the one we have on screen, which is from the WBCSD's guidance on avoided emissions. So finally, I would like, before we leave the floor, to dispel a few of the most common myths on avoided emissions. The first one being that there is no framework for avoided emissions. So this is both true and false. There is indeed no unique international framework today, like the GHG protocol can be for carbon footprinting, for example. But there are robust and convergent methodological frameworks. We have actually already mentioned two of them in this very presentation, which are NZI in France and the WBCSD. Indicating how you choose your reference scenario, how do you compute avoided emissions, what are your eligibility criteria, and so on. However, transparency and homogenization of practices are still challenges today in the world of avoided emissions. And this is where the Climate Dividends Initiative is so interesting and why Laura will be able to talk to you more about it later. Secondly, reporting our own emissions prevents us from showing our positive impact. So this is very false. It's essential to measure your own emissions through the pillar A that we've seen just before, in order to avoid greenwashing, to avoid cherry picking, and to have a good understanding of what the emissions of your solution are. So the measure of avoided emissions is complementary to this study, and it highlights the positive role you can have in transition. And it's also important to understand that working on reducing your own emissions will also have a positive feedback on your own avoided emissions, because by reducing the emissions of your solution, you increase your avoided emissions. So these two things, the pillar A and the pillar B, are very complementary initiatives, and you should be thinking about them together. Finally, my solution is green, so it necessarily avoids emissions. Unfortunately, this can be true or it can be false. So the truth is that the environment is a very complex and multifactorial system, and you can have solutions that do have a very positive impact on other environmental factors, but that does not necessarily translate into avoided emissions. Because the truth is, climate is only one criteria among many in environmental impact, and some solutions that do benefit other areas of the environment can be as or even more carbon intensive as their alternatives. So we have had the case sometimes that clients come to us with such green solutions and get disappointed when at the end we don't measure avoided emissions. So it's important to remember that while avoided emissions are a very important indicator, they are not the be-all and all of environmental indicators either. And in some cases, if you have such solutions, other approaches, such as a life cycle analysis on a broader range of indicators, might be more suitable for you. So I hope that I've managed to give you a broad overview of avoided emissions, how we calculate them, what are the key critical things to think about, and the pitfalls. And now we'll leave the floor back to Agatha and Laura to talk to you more about climate dividends.
Thank you, Thomas. So yeah, this was an introduction. You probably have a lot of questions. Maybe you want to know if it can fit to your own context. So do not hesitate to ask this question in the little question tab at the bottom right of your screen. Sorry. And now, without further ado, I will leave the floor to Laura to get into a deeper presentation of what climate dividends are and how it can be relevant for you.
Well, thank you very much. So thanks, Thomas, for setting the scene of what avoided emissions are. And I believe that many of you, I saw a few questions while this first presentation, see that avoided emissions are super interesting to actually, complete this sort of negative impact that we all measure, or most of us are starting to measure, on the carbon footprint and what we do bad. But it is completing this from a positive side of, okay, what do we do positively, and also how do you show that a company actually creates this sort of climate value, is contributing to decarbonization. So it's a super important metric and approach, but today it is still not very much leveraged for many reasons. A lot of them were explained by Thomas. There's an issue of standardization, of also comprehension of that, or understandable. How do you understand that measure? And so this is really where climate dividends come in. The idea was they were conceived to tackle all of those challenges, so to enable the standardization and the valuation of that positive climate contribution that a company can have through the products and services that they sell, and enable it to link it back to these investors. So very concretely, one climate dividend represents 1 ton of CO2 equivalent avoided or removed by the activity of a company that can then be issued and distributed to the financial stakeholders of that company. So what we say is that it's a sort of mirror of a financial dividend for climate. Why do we say this? Because when you're a company that succeeds economically, you'll eventually be able to distribute financial dividends for your shareholders. So it's cash, but it's also a proof of that financial value that you've created. Well, here the idea is kind of the same. climate dividends are not money, it's an extra financial information, but they represent a proof of that climate value that you created. So very concretely, it works in a 5-step process. The first one, and Thomas quickly tackled on it, is eligibility criteria. Not all companies can enter. The idea is at minimum, for example, to have done a carbon footprint. Exactly like in finance, you're not going to talk about your revenues if you don't know about your spendings, but there's no reason why you should speak only about your spendings. You also want to talk about what you gain. So here, the same idea. And then we look at activities that are really contributing to global decarbonization. If you're doing a Kit Kat, and I don't have anything against Kit Kats or whatever, but if you're doing something that is not compliant with a 1.5 or 2.2 degrees world, even if you're doing in a less carbon world, maybe you're not really contributing global decarbonization. But if you're looking at anything from transport to energy production to enabling us to get a bit of clothing, a bit of fooding, a bit of heating, all those things are necessary, and we want them to be done in a much less carbon intensive way. So we've got some eligibility criteria that are here just to frame the thing. Then the second step is really to evaluate, to assess this avoided emission. And so, as Thomas said, there's no one big, very harmonized framework, but there are things that are starting. The WBCSD, so the World Business Council, can we remain on the previous slide, please? Yeah. The World Business Council of Sustainable Development puts a sort of global framework, and we at Climate Dividends provide a generic protocol that is aligned with the WBCSD, but provides something a bit more standardized and operational, with very concrete rule on how to define the reference scenario that Thomas mentioned, the attribution key as well along the value chain, but also how to communicate around it. And what's very interesting in our work, and I'm a little biased as you can hear, but anyway, is that we have sort of sectoral declination, application of that protocol. So very concretely, what does that mean for mobility? What does that mean for electricity production? What does that mean for geothermal energy, for building renovation, for circularity, for waste? And for each of them, we've got what we call cookbooks, which are, well, very precise guideline of what are the reference scenario, what are the attribution keys, what are the main hypotheses that one should apply to calculate the avoided emission in that given sector. The interest here is really to help that harmonization part. All of what we do is in open source. You can consult it in our website and use it. But it also enables to avoid double counting and to make it easier to apply, whether for the company or for an investor that wants to apply it for its portcos, because all those questions are already addressed. We're not saying this is perfect, but it really enables the standardization and credibility to move forward. The third step is the validation and verification here, and that's Thomas already mentioned it very briefly. We've got certified auditors, so auditors that we train so that they can look at the compliance to the methodology and the verification of data to really make sure that the claims that are going to go through this are, well, credible. And this then enables to convert those avoided emissions that have been certified, verified, into climate dividends. 1 ton of CO2 enables to issue 1 climate dividend in a public registry. So there's a lot of transparency that comes in. And the final step, the 5th step, is this distribution. So the climate dividends issued by the company are going to be distributed to the financial shareholders. Here we are inspired by the distribution rule from the PCAF, if some of you are familiar with it. So split between the debt and the equity. And so you've got climate dividends for debt and climate dividends for equity. So this process really enables 2 main benefits. Here you can go to the next slide. The first one, as you understood, I think, at the standardization part, we really want that when a company issues or communicates about a climate dividend, or when an investor communicates about a climate dividends received, we know that this is something that we can trust, that is going to be comparable between sector, between funds, and that is trustworthy. That comes from the protocol, from the third-party verification, and from the transparency. This is really important if we want this notion to count and to be used more globally. Some of you here might already use it, but many, I don't know exactly who's here, so I'm not going to be able to say whether, very precisely, but the problem is that if everyone has their own method, their own process, even their own verification process, well, we really lack this sort of comparison and, metric for everyone. And the second interest is really to guarantee and enable this sort of investment traceability. And very concretely, for fun, when you receive a climate dividend, it really serves as a sort of measure of the climate efficiency of your capital allocation. And you can use them all along the investment cycle, especially leveraging it through specific ratios that we've worked on too. And that can be the next slide. So the idea is to say, okay, avoided emissions are interesting, but what's most interesting is how do you integrate it into the climate strategy or the operational and strategic business plan of your company or from your investment cycle. So for this, you can look, for example, at the climate dividends efficiency. So you compare climate dividends to the carbon footprint, because it's not the same thing to, if we think of the infrastructure world, well, these are quite carbon intensive. You need to spend some carbon to build railways, to build solar installation, but you normally are going to avoid a lot of emission thanks to this. So the efficiency of this might be higher than something like a software, which is going to spend less CO2, but is going to avoid less as well. So we think that this is a very interesting way of addressing this without also having a compensation logic of, okay, I do bad and I just erase it. Now here you can really sort of monitor both of this. The second thing that can be interesting is that climate dividends intensity, where you look at the ability of a company to issue climate dividends compared to the revenue that it generates. And that's quite interesting to see how the alignment of the company in terms of interest between making more money and making more impact. This is a very interesting information, both in due diligence, in monitoring, because it also kind of shows you, okay, how risky or how complicated is it going to be to make this company compliant or align with a transition that is going to happen from an investor perspective. And the third one is a quite basic one, but quite useful, of a climate ROI, of having your climate dividends received per euros invested to really quantify, but also compare your investment and integrate this little by little in the financial valuation of companies to enable the sort of quantification of what's something that we could call a climate goodwill. And so I think just summarizing it very quickly, but the idea of climate dividends is really to enable the standardization of that metric by this process that I've described, but also to talk a much more financial language around this notion and to go away from just, those talks of expert among ESG responsible about avoided emission. That can be quite of a technical notion, as you all know here, and to make it something a little bit more financially marketing, especially when you want to talk with LPs, when you want to push your companies into this and to count as much, or at least to go towards counting it as much as just the financial results of the company. Should I say this, I guess? Yeah? What do you want me to do?
I can jump in. So just as a quick information in case you might be interested, we're also doing this webinar because very recently we've been certified as a reference partner of climate dividends. And this gives now to Carbonmetrics the possibility to, on the 5-step process that Laura described earlier, to work with the companies on the first 2 ones, so eligibility criteria and evaluation of the tons of avoided emissions. So we can help you through the beginning of the process. And there's now 4 sectors that have a dedicated methodology, and I think the mobility cookbook was just released. So renewable energy, low carbon heating, renovation buildings, and mobility. So specifically on those 4, there's a dedicated methodology, but this doesn't mean then if you think you might be eligible to others, because the activity doesn't fall into those 4 ones, we can definitely start working together. And since I think it's the beginning of your reference partner kind of program, there will be like special care for the companies that will start working in this, because we are really working closely with Climate Dividend on those ones. I don't know, Laura, if you want to add something.
Yeah, just maybe one thing that this idea, our role, and this is one specificity of, we are a non-for-profit, and our main objective is to make those methodologies on avoided emissions more widespread, and to help everyone integrating it, both from a company and an investor perspective. And this is typically why we collaborate with many reference partners like Carbonmetrics, so that when you, as an investor or a companies, work with a consultant or do things on their side, not everyone keeps reinventing the wheel. So that, it might be interesting, but it's just still different. So here that we can, build something all together that is quicker and gets more value out of it, because it will be widely recognized and leveraged financially.
Thank you, Laura. So now we just hit the half an hour threshold, so we're right on time. And I will now welcome Jocelyne to the stage for the next part of this conversation. So Laura will be our interviewer for this part, and I'll leave you the floor to you again, Laura, to introduce Jocelyne.
Well, hi, Jocelyne. Thank you so much for being here. Maybe the idea would be if you can briefly introduce yourself and tell us who you are, and also tell us directly about Blue Like an Orange, who's kind of a unique impact thesis. So if you can also briefly introduce your fund's mission to start with, and then we'll look at why are you guys looking now at avoided emissions.
Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here this morning. I'm Director of Sustainability at Blue Like an Orange. And Blue Like an Orange was founded in 2018, so now 6-7 years ago, with a vision that to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, private investment needed to be mobilized towards impact-driven businesses in emerging markets. And as a transition couldn't only take place in Europe or the global north, let's say, but we really needed to focus on the emerging market. It's a private debt fund. We've raised about 480 million across 2 sub-funds, and these 2 sub-funds are Article 9, 100% sustainable investment with a social objective. Nevertheless, we have several climate investments in our portfolios, including, for example, in the transportation sector, or some bike sharing platform in Latam. We have solar farms in Brazil, or energy efficient buildings and social housing in Mexico. So we do have several climate solutions in our portfolio, and as such, we do collect from our portfolio companies avoided emissions KPIs. Yeah, I don't know if I should keep going or I should stop here.
No, I think it's very interesting already to set the thing that you guys have both this sort of social and climate thing, and that you're looking more and more into climate as it is one of the big topic of the transition as a whole. Maybe just one thing of, I know that you're now looking into a new sort of impact framework, more focus on climate, and that in that regard, you intend to integrate avoided emission as a key KPI into that, which was not something that you were doing before. So can you tell us a bit more why you decide about this framework, and why you decided to make avoided emission a more important KPI into it?
Indeed, in our previous framework, which was named SDG Blue Impact Scoring, we would really define the key impact KPI investment by investment, and this could be avoided emissions or renewable energy capacity, but it could also be number of patients or share of underserved beneficiaries for this or this services. So with this new framework, which is really focused on climate impact, and filling funding gaps for climate investment in emerging markets. We want to have an holistic approach and reconcile environmental, social, and economic imperatives. So avoided emission will still be one dimension, but it will be key to have a harmonized methodology and be able to consolidate reliable KPIs at a company sectorial portfolio level.
Mhm.
And I would say, most of all, be able to monitor our portfolio and engage with our portfolio companies. Because as an impact fund, we don't measure just for measurement's sake, but the way we design impact measurement is really to ensure we do the best with our investments in terms of impact, maybe identify opportunities for impact enhancement,
Mhm.
monitor the performance over the investment period, and really engage towards enhancing impact, which I find also very important and interesting. Indeed, we are not a renewable energy fund only. We have even if in this new framework that is focused on impact, it will be diversified in terms of impact themes. So avoided emission might be relevant. In other case, it would, like Thomas said earlier, it wouldn't be the best KPI to measure impact, but at least when avoided emissions are relevant, we want to, again, to compute them in a really harmonized, reliable and way with this external verification, which is very important for us.
Okay, super interesting. And maybe can you tell us a bit more what you decided to put into that framework? So there's this avoided emission KPI, but I know that you intended also to use maybe ACT. Can you tell us a little bit more of what kind of frameworks you intend to work, and where do you set objectives? I know that when you discussed, you also said that in terms of objectives, you might not put portfolio-wide, but remain at company-specific objectives to really be able to, as you say, leverage and monitor their own impact.
So, so there is an impact scoring at portco level and at investment transaction level. And this impact scoring reflects the 5 dimensions of impact, including the scale. And as part of the scale of the impact, we have avoided emissions, but not only. We really have the, notably the who and the beneficiaries of impact, but also the risks. And so we have malus, or we decrease the impact score when risks are identified and not yet mitigated. We also included in this impact scoring some themes related to the just transition, which are economic development, community buy-in, and climate physical risk, and in general resilience, which is an important aspect as well. So this impact scoring is multidimensional, and one of the criteria will be to, when relevant, meaning when we invest in climate solutions, to be able to demonstrate that the investment led to a scaling of avoided emissions. That's one aspect. And then company, for each company and for each investment, we set targets and we monitor the reach of the targets by our portfolio companies, like other impact funds. And indeed, what we did for the two first funds, and we intend to keep doing. And actually, we have, and I encourage you to look at our impact report, but we have really an impact performance dashboard with fund level KPIs and how we do or don't meet them. This dashboard was selected by the CPA training in the UK as a model in their textbook about impact management, because at the end of the day, it's really important to have this portfolio view on impact. And quite often it's complex, since each investment might have different then in our case, especially diversified impact thesis and impact KPIs. And so we excluded just having fund targets in terms of avoided emissions. We see, for example, gigaton funds that are funded with the purpose of avoiding, for example, 1 gigaton of emissions over the life of the fund. But when we looked at indeed this type of targets that were announced by climate funds, and we realized how complex and heterogeneous methodologies for setting such targets and publishing such outcome. We decided not to set such target, but rather keep looking at avoided emissions at company level and have other KPIs at fund level that do imply that we look at avoided emission when it's relevant.
Yeah. And that's super interesting, because I mean, we started to discuss with you, Jocelyne, because you were interested in climate dividends for those kind of problematic of harmonization, of third-party verification, as you mentioned earlier. Can you share maybe a little bit more about the challenges that you've encountered when you were putting this new impact framework? So you've talked about this sort of lack of comparability already, and I just wanted to share a very quick anecdote on this, because I think it was relevant. This is really typically why we created climate dividends. And when we did this sort of the white paper that we published last week with the ratios that I've shared a little bit earlier, we redid a little bit of an exercise of looking at the top 5 renewable producers in the world. And we looked at their claims in terms of avoided emission, and none of them were comparable. When you would expect them to be somehow comparable, because they do the same job, the same activities, and they had quite similar sizes, and they were absolutely not comparable. And because some of them were attributing, some of them had different reference scenario, or some of them you had no idea because the information is not transparent. So what we really did was, to say, we need a workflow that enables this standardization and this trust that can be built. And so this is why we created climate dividends, and why we want those ratios to enable benchmarks, so that tomorrow, Jocelyne and maybe some of you guys can say, okay, this is a good climate dividends efficiency ratio, and we'll know it because we'll have a lot of people in there. So I know this is, Jocelyne, one of the things that there was a problem or an obstacle that you guys faced when putting this framework. But you mentioned others, typically maybe you can share a little bit of, the lack of data accessibility, especially in emerging markets where you guys work.
Yes, and indeed it was a surprise for us, because having measured for years very complex and again diversified social impacts, whereas for in the healthcare sector, agricultural sector, and financial inclusion, or many other activities, we were surprised of the the lack of benchmarks on such, let's say, simple KPI, which is avoided emission at fund level for a climate fund, which we thought we could easily find benchmarks. So, and indeed, over the past few years, we took part to the GIN benchmarks initiatives, for example, in financial inclusion in healthcare. And generally speaking, we are really keen to, contribute our level and actually to share data in open source to build these benchmarks that are really critical for the industry to be able to communicate on impact and to analyze impact performance against what would be expected. Is it normal? Is it really disappointed? Is it like an overperformance? And today we are not able to do so. So that's why we are really supportive of the climate dividend initiative. And indeed, another aspect, but to be honest, people often say that since we are investing in emerging markets, we have a data issue. We actually have a lot and very good data. Portfolio companies take part to the reporting campaigns every year in a very committed way. We do control the quality of data. But the point is on climate, on avoided emissions. Each company had his own, let's say, a methodology, including reference scenarios, factors and so forth that we verified during the due diligence, but then we just took as granted the carbon emissions figure that was shared by the portfolio companies. And what we would like to do is really to collect the raw data and compute ourselves with a harmonized methodologies, the avoided emission of the portfolio.
Well, hopefully that's what we'll be able to do together. And maybe one, and I know I just wanted to share something that you said that is very interesting and resonate what Thomas also said earlier on, is that, well, as you very clearly said, Jocelyn, there's avoided emission, but that's not the only thing. And you guys also trying to balance avoided emission with other ESG priorities. And I know typically you mentioned the example of solar panels in the Amazon, where there was biodiversity risk. And so I think the idea of putting a strong KPI on avoided emission is very important. And I mean, I'm very supportive of that, of course, but it's important to see that this is embedded in a more general framework, either when you're a pure impact fund like you guys, or even if you're just, a fund that wants to have a sort of a holistic way on ESG. So I think that was also interesting to keep in mind for fellow investors that are listening to that. And maybe one last thing to finish up and wrap up. So you guys have a very strong input and focus on avoided emissions and broader impact. Now, how do you plan to communicate this to your LPs? Do you have any best practices to share to the others on how to do this and what you did? So you mentioned the benchmark, the dashboard, that you guys have. Do you have other things that you would recommend to the others to do that you found interesting?
So for climate solutions, we do communicate publicly on consolidated avoided emissions, and then we have other reporting sent to LPs with individual investments avoided emissions. And we do follow the PCAF rule in terms of consolidation to account for the attribution ratio. But what I want to say, and it's part of the assessment, as we say, it's not about just ticking the box, being a climate solution and summing up avoided emissions. It's really the assessment needs to be holistic and account for all dimensions, and some of them can be measured and others are qualitative. And I think in the way to communicate about impact performance, and we took part over the past year to the pilot of Impact Frontiers and the new norm in terms of impact reporting for funds. The point is that next to these KPIs, there are two things. The first thing is really transparency and about the methodology, about being as transparent about as possible about what is published. And the other thing is the narrative and case studies that can really help understand the nature of our impact, but also the nature of our engagement with portfolio companies and what we do in more challenging and difficult cases. And I think this is also very important for credibility instead of just, consolidating the avoided emission and saying we contribute to, climate mitigation, and here are avoided emissions. It's very important to be transparent, but also provide some context and as much as possible case studies that illustrate the change we intend to drive.
Yeah, that's super clear, and I think that's a good. It's not just the destination, but the way you get to it is as important almost. And I think this really resonates with both the explanations of Thomas in the beginning and what we try to do at Climate Dividends of making this more transparent, more usable, and make the figures. And yes, the end figure of how many climate dividends you get is important, but the comparison, the way you monitor it in time, is even more than just an X figure that you can.
And indeed, the ratios, putting things in perspective and acknowledging that not everything is completely perfect, but we are working on the dilemmas and have a strong, measurable, demonstrable contribution, but with all the safeguards and being really careful in the communication, and again, very transparent. And that's also important, I think, to rely on methodologies that are open source. Since inception, we've put our impact scoring methodology on our website, and I think it's the way forward to really share knowledge and be collectively in a continuous learning and sharing mode among actors in the industry, whether it's companies, but also funds and players like you. So looking forward
to line with the transparency and open source aspect. I'll let you maybe wrap up since we've only took a few seconds.
Thank you, Laura. Just that maybe I have one last question for you, Jocelyne. We have a lot of private debt clients, and they're always wondering what leverage they have on their investments, since most of what you do happen when you actually sign the funding. So do you use SLL? How do you make sure that your investment actually follow the KPIs and the road that you set for them?
So in the credit agreement, quite often as part of the ENS action plan, we have some, what we call sustainability value creating actions. So initiatives that we identified pre-investments and that are a condition to the loan to enhance impact or remediate risk, and then all monitoring, quarterly monitoring, yearly monitoring with portfolio companies really help us to identify any issue or opportunity along the way. And companies see it rather as value added and something that helps them also be more robust and communicate towards other stakeholders and potentially other impact investors, better to communicate on their impact. So quite often they take part, or reporting campaigns are really receptive to feedback or initiatives that make their impact even more robust. So we are also very humble and transparent about our engagement activities in our report, and we publish KPIs such as, number of indeed meeting hold with portfolio companies over the year, or share of portfolio companies with which we have this type of ongoing engagement. So it's not systematic, but we do engage, and we do have a relationship with a portfolio company that make it possible to do interesting things. And that's what we develop in the case studies in the report.
So you're saying it's more the relationship that you set with them and the meetings that you have regularly to follow the KPIs that actually were set prior to investment. And from what I hear from you, it's not the stick; it's more the carrot, and you're actually
driving. Of both. A bit of both, but not only the stick. And one of our selection criteria is really the mindset of the management of the company, and to work with impact-driven companies. So quite often they are quite keen on working on certain aspects, and it's what they are looking for also when they work with us and have us as investors. Then if they don't have the resources and it's not a priority and it's something secondary, we also need to prioritize all the time and really choose our battles and what we think will create value with the company. But yes, when it's put this way, it's more attractive than just the stick.
Thank you. We have 4 minutes left, so we'll race to answer the last questions that haven't been answered yet. Thank you, Jocelyne. Thank you, Laura, also for the quality of the conversation you both just had. I think there was one question from Mark. Is there a threshold that eligible companies and projects need to fulfill in order to generate dividends? In other words, how relevant versus the carbon footprint must be the avoided over removed emissions to be eligible? Do you have any input on this, Laura?
Yeah, sure. So the eligibility criteria that we have are, there's one on the company level, so that you have minimum to have done your carbon footprint, no matter how much it will be. And when you're a big company, so we use the threshold of the SBTI, not to reinvent the wheel. You have to have a transition plan that is done in a credible scientific way. It can be SBTI, it can be ACT, it can be others. The GFANS framework as well is quite useful, we found. So these are the only KPI eligibility criteria that you have on the company side. On the activity side, it really must be an activity that is contributing to global decarbonization. So here you can either prove it through the eligibility, not alignment, but eligibility to the EU taxonomy, or the direct mention in the IPCC report. You can also find other ways, but these are kind of the sort of two easy way to do so. And there's no amount, a minimum amount to be eligible. This is why, but because we believe that anyone, exactly like for finance, you're eligible to make money. That doesn't mean that you're actually going to make money or that you're going to be very profitable, but you can be eligible to. And then this is where, for example, the ratio comparing the climate dividends to the carbon footprint is super important and super interesting. Because of course, if you're a huge company, you probably very automatically will be making more climate dividends, more avoided emission than a small company, but potentially your efficiency ratio is going to be way lower. So these sort of the eligibility criteria are not here to tackle everything, but then the way you use it, and typically for a fund, you could decide to put a threshold of, I want to finance companies that only have a climate dividends efficiency ratio of above 1, above 2, above 10, or whatever. We're here to kind of set the vocabulary, and then you can use this to define your own role. Exactly like you would say, you need the EBITDA concept to exist. Then you can decide that a good company for you is a company that has an EBITDA of X.
Thank you, Laura. We have another question from Mark. Regarding the financial value of 1 ton of CO2 when comparing climate dividends with ROI, do you incorporate a financial market value for the dividend when communicated with investors? And meaning that, do you account for carbon price?
That's a super good question as well. Thank you, Mark. Currently, the idea of a climate dividend is not to be a financial asset. So it's not a financial, it doesn't have one specific financial value. The objective is first to set the concept, then the method, for example, the climate ROI. But then also, if you look at financial valuation, you could say that you'd look at the multiple of annual climate dividend, or you could even do a sort of discounted climate dividend flow, or those kind of things, to which you can put a price. We're not the one putting a price yet, but we strongly encourage companies or investors to start looking at, if you've got an internal carbon price, you can use it. We also collaborate with initiatives like the Impact Valuation Hub, for example, who's looking at how to put a financial value into this. So the idea is that the climate dividends is not money in itself, but it can help put a price to sort of find a climate goodwill, which will have a financial value accounted in the financial valuation, or that will influence the multiple for a multiple of EBITDA valuation. So it's kind of in between. But yeah, we don't define a price, but we set the path so that a price can be put into that climate positive contribution.
Thank you, Laura. Great question indeed. It's always the one that we have. This question from Tim Claris. What do you think about the new Task Force for Corporate Action Transparency, TCAT, a framework for reporting climate action? I personally haven't heard about it, as I quickly looked it up, but maybe, I don't know, Laura, if you've heard about it.
So I've heard, to be honest, heard about it, but absolutely not an expert of it. So I'm very happy to dive in a bit more and to discuss it a little bit more clearly, team, to see how it could relate. So I don't have a very precise answer, but I think it's just the opportunity to say that climate dividends are really made to be a sort of, proven, identified data point or metric that can be used in broader frameworks to stop reinventing that little part. So climate dividends isn't a label that will say it's good or bad. It's meant to be used by other. Could be if tomorrow, for example, the SBTi looked at positive contribution, it could be used, but it could also be used maybe for how to report that specific part of avoided emissions. So theoretically, I'd say that makes a lot of sense, but since I'm not an expert yet of that one, I'm very happy to take that question and do a sort of written follow-up afterwards, team, if you want.
Thank you, Laura. And there was one last question from Samia. How can we ensure engagement of boards or sponsors with carbon data disclosure when the debt investor is taking part in syndicated loans? So I don't know if Jocelyn, is Blue Like an Orange in some syndicated loans? And she mentioned if no carbon data is available, no avoided emission can be computed. So have you taken part in syndicated loans where you weren't like the lead investor?
Yes, and it's true that it adds a layer of complexity, but still it's possible, and on a voluntary basis, because in this case it's not in their loan agreement. Companies do report using our reporting platform, and we do engage and have meetings with these portfolio companies on impact and sustainability once a year as the other ones. But it's really the relationship and convincing that we can add value and help them grow their impact that makes them cooperate with us as a sustainability team.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I have one follow-up question on this. Do you invest in syndicated loans with other investors that are not impact investors, or do you only invest with impact investors?
In our case, it's with DFIs.
Okay.
They also have an impact framework, which is different, but they do have, require regular reporting, have an action plan, and so forth. So we wouldn't invest. I mean, so far with non-impact investor or impact-driven investors, let's say.
And I think maybe, again, if I can, I know we've run a little bit of time, so I'll just wrap it up. But I think that's quite interesting. We see how we can collaborate from funds like in private equity, for example, that can, have a direct relationship. So it's a bit easier for data collection or for relationship. But we're also starting to work well in the listed equity world, where same kind of problematic, where you don't necessarily have access or the same kind of relationship with your portfolio companies. We hear climate dividends or those kind of topic can first start as a sort of an engagement topic, rather than right away from a key measurement metric. And this can set the path to go towards the metric. But first is an engagement, as a sensibilization, and a sort of more strategic discussion.
Thank you. I think we're into the end. Sorry, we were 4 minutes late. Again, I will say that the replay, the slides, and the Q&A. So thank you for all of your questions. I think they were really interesting. I want to thank you warmly, Jocelyne, for being here with us and sharing some insights on how Blue Like an Orange Sustainable Capital manages their impact framework and how avoided emissions can fit into this broader impact thesis that they have for their investments. Thank you, Laura, for being here, and also for this interview with Jocelyne. If you have any questions on climate dividends or carbon metrics, you can follow up you can answer to the email that will be sent out at the end of the webinar. And we will be happy to have you again in our next webinars. Thank you all. And
thanks so much.
Yeah, enjoy your meal. Bye-bye. Thank you, Jocelyne.
Bye.